I still remember the afternoon I stood outside my parents' front door with my hand hovering over the handle, wondering why coming home for a weekend visit suddenly felt harder than giving a presentation at work. The paint around the frame had faded, the familiar wind chime rattled softly in the breeze, and through the kitchen window I could see two figures moving around, preparing lunch, as if nothing had changed. Yet everything inside me felt strangely distant. I had spent years telling myself I was too busy to visit often. There was always another deadline, another opportunity, another excuse that sounded reasonable enough to believe. Whenever my mother called and asked, "Have you been eating well?" I answered quickly and promised to visit next month. Whenever my father texted a short message asking if everything was going smoothly, I replied with a thumbs-up emoji, because I assumed there would always be another chance for a real conversation. Back then, I believed relationships survived automatically, like furniture left untouched in a room that would still be waiting exactly where I left it. The first thing my mother said when she opened the door was not a complaint, but, "You look tired." I laughed and insisted I was fine. My father simply took my overnight bag without asking and carried it inside. During lunch we discussed harmless things, the weather, neighbors, rising grocery prices, but every silence seemed to contain years of conversations we had never finished. Later that evening I found an old photo album while looking for blankets in a closet. Between faded pictures was a school essay I had written as a child, describing my parents as the strongest people in the world. I smiled at the childish handwriting until I realized I no longer thought of them that way. Somewhere along the road to adulthood, I had unconsciously reversed our roles, expecting them to understand every decision I made, while rarely trying to understand theirs. That realization lingered in my mind for weeks. Around the same time, a coworker confided that they had not spoken to a parent in years after a misunderstanding over career choices. "Every conversation becomes an argument," they sighed. I instinctively took their side because I knew what it felt like to think parents simply did not understand modern life. But the conversation stayed with me, and one evening curiosity led me to read about family communication research. I stumbled across a concept that genuinely surprised me. Psychologists have found that people often remember the emotional tone of repeated interactions more strongly than the exact words exchanged, meaning that small moments of warmth or criticism accumulate over time and shape the relationship more than a single dramatic event. I had never known that. I always assumed the major arguments mattered most, yet suddenly I could see how years of rushed phone calls, distracted listening, and postponed visits quietly built distance without either side intending it. That discovery changed the way I saw my own family. I began paying attention to tiny exchanges instead of waiting for meaningful occasions. When my mother sent a photo of vegetables growing in the garden, I asked questions instead of reacting with a simple emoji. When my father mentioned repairing something around the house, I called to hear the story behind it rather than changing the subject. None of these conversations lasted long, but they felt different. During one visit I offered to help clean the storage room. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while old boxes released the faint smell of paper that had aged for decades. We found toys, notebooks, broken radios, and receipts nobody needed anymore. At the bottom of one box lay a bundle of envelopes, tied with string. My mother hesitated before handing them to me. They contained school notices, medical bills, and carefully folded lists of household expenses from years when money had been scarce. Some months had handwritten calculations squeezed into the margins, where every small cost was counted twice before being paid. I stared at those pages in silence, because I had grown up believing our childhood was ordinary. I never realized how carefully every purchase had been planned so that I would not notice what my parents were giving up. My father saw my expression and chuckled awkwardly. "You weren't supposed to see those," he said. "Children should worry about homework, not electricity bills." For the first time in years, we talked without pretending everything had always been easy. He admitted there had been nights when he wondered if he was making the right decisions. My mother confessed she sometimes stayed awake worrying that she was too strict. I surprised myself by admitting that I had spent much of my teenage years convinced they judged every choice I made. She looked genuinely confused. "We worried," she answered softly. "That's different from judging." The sentence settled into the room with surprising weight. Over the following months, old misunderstandings did not disappear overnight. We still disagreed about work, money, and lifestyle choices. Sometimes conversations became tense. Sometimes I left visits feeling frustrated. But instead of replaying every disagreement, I started asking myself what fear or hope might be hidden beneath the words. My father's insistence on saving money often came from memories of instability. My mother's repeated reminders to call were less about control than about wanting reassurance that I was safe. Once I forgot to answer messages for an entire day while traveling. By the time I finally called back, my mother sounded relieved before she sounded annoyed. "I knew you were probably busy," she admitted, "but the imagination is louder than logic." I laughed at first, then realized I had probably caused unnecessary worry many times before. Months later, I watched an elderly couple sitting quietly together in a waiting area while visiting for a routine appointment. They barely spoke, but every few minutes one would adjust the other's sleeve or point out something interesting through the window. Their companionship reminded me that closeness is often maintained through repeated small acts, rather than grand declarations. That image resurfaced when I visited home again, and found my father polishing an old chair that no longer matched anything in the house. "Why keep fixing it?" I asked. He shrugged and said, "It still works." I suddenly wondered whether he approached relationships the same way, repairing instead of replacing whenever possible. The biggest turning point arrived unexpectedly after an ordinary dinner. We sat around the table longer than usual, because rain drummed steadily against the roof, and nobody wanted to wash dishes immediately. Conversation drifted from childhood stories to embarrassing mistakes, then to relatives we had not seen in years. At one point, my mother laughed so hard that she wiped tears from her eyes, while my father corrected details she insisted were true. Watching them tease each other over memories older than I was, I felt something loosen inside me. I realized I had spent years measuring our relationship by the conversations we never had, instead of appreciating the quiet reliability of the ones we did. As the evening ended, my father asked whether I would visit again next month. Without checking my calendar or making promises I might postpone, I simply answered. Driving away the next morning, I noticed the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind trees. But the strange heaviness I used to carry after leaving was gone. I knew there would still be disagreements, missed calls, and moments of impatience, because families are built from imperfect people rather than perfect intentions. Yet I also understood something I had overlooked for much of my adult life. The bond between parents and children is shaped less by dramatic reconciliations than by countless ordinary choices to answer the phone, stay for another cup of tea, ask one more question, or return home one more weekend, while everyone still has the chance to sit around the same table.